Perfect. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2. I'm Greg. I'm a researcher at Animal Charity Evaluators, and I'll be your MC for today. Thank you to JC for taking care of things yesterday. Before we get going, I just wanted to take a couple minutes to kind of reflect on our day yesterday. I think we heard a lot of talks. I think it was something like 15, lots of different ideas. One thing that I find is really useful when you're at conferences like this is just to reflect a bit on the day before, so that to get the most of the talks that we're going to hear today, we remember what ideas, things we talked about yesterday, we can make those connections a bit better. So I'm just going to really briefly remind us all what we talked about. So we started the day with Peter Singer. He gave a nice overview of how the way we think about animals has been changing over time, pointed out some areas where we still need to make some progress. John Bachman came up, did a nice State of the Movement address. Then we had our first panel. Nick Cooney did a great job using concrete examples, explaining why we should strive to do boring research. And then, inspired by that message, we had Crystal and Bobby come up and give two of the most boring talks I can say I've ever seen. I actually really enjoyed them. There's an advocacy intervention talk, a messaging talk. The intervention research talk was about testing the effects of online ads, and the messaging talk was about comparing the reduce and eliminate messages. In the afternoon, we heard about the mental lives and experiences of animals. So Adam introduced this interesting idea that there are different dimensions to pain, and experiencing pain and finding pain unpleasant might be different things, and so it's really hard to really understand who is suffering and how to measure it. I thought this point was highlighted nicely by Georgia later when she was talking about the abnormal repetitive behaviors and how sometimes these behaviors are actually a sign of coping. And so together those talks kind of made me think quite a bit. We learned an extreme amount in a great presentation by Becca about the interesting complex mental lives and behaviors of fish. And then in addition to learning about the mental lives of animals, we also learned about how people think about the mental lives of animals. So that's mind perception, and how that might influence our judgments of animals. After that, we heard some foundational psychological research. So Hal talked about some ideas and theories that might be relevant for animal advocates. I learned about the psychology of conflicted omnivores, and then talked about shared social identities and how our ability to feel solidarity with animals might be one underlying motivation for why we might want to help them. We ended the day hearing about some relatively novel considerations in animal advocacy. So one was the value of animal studies programs, which I think is a great example of an intervention that could have long-term indirect effects, but might be hard to measure. And then finally, we heard from Garrett Broad, who made a very important and compelling call for animal advocates to increase diversity, embrace inclusion, and anti-racism. And so that's just a nice refresher. I know sometimes it's hard after all these talks to exactly remember what happened, but hopefully that'll help you get the most out of these talks. So that's what we heard about yesterday. Before we get going, I'll just give you a brief overview of what's to come today. So I'm actually going to start things off by giving a brief talk about the Animal Advocacy Research Fund. We're then going to have another panel on advocacy research. So this time hearing about leafleting, YouTube videos, as well as a broader talk about the challenges and solutions, challenges of research in animal advocacy and possible solutions. After that, we'll have a break. We'll come back and then hear about some exciting and innovative approaches to helping animals, including potential technological advances and responsible investing. Then we'll have lunch, and after lunch, we'll have one final panel discussing ideas about, broader ideas about research and effectiveness, including social movement growth. Finally, John Bachman will come up and give some closing remarks for the symposium, and then we'll have some open time for networking. So that is the plan for us. So that means I'll get started right now and give you a brief talk about the Animal Advocacy Research Fund. So the Animal Advocacy Research Fund is a grants program hosted by ACE to support research that contributes to an understanding of effective animal advocacy. This program was launched in February, and I'm not sure if everyone's heard of it, but we think that it's a really relevant thing for people at this conference to hear about. We want to give a little overview right now. One critical issue that we've learned about throughout the symposium so far, is that we have very limited evidence to tell us which interventions do the most good. So interventions differ greatly in their methods, their messages, their resources required, and ultimately the potential positive outcomes for animals. Without rigorous evidence, it can be difficult to ensure that we're using our limited resources in ways that help animals as much as possible. So this is why the Animal Advocacy Research Fund was created. A generous benefactor has committed $1 million to be used for this program over the next 2 to 3 years. We're going to distribute this funding through grants to advocates, academics, and other qualified researchers who conduct research on effective animal advocacy. It's a standard granting competition program. So we're going to put out calls for proposals, solicit applications, evaluate them, and then award funding to a select number of applications. Over the next 2 to 3 years, we'll put out a call for proposals about every 4 to 6 months. We just finished our first funding round a few weeks ago. We expect the next funding deadline will be about the end of January. Just to give you an idea of what kind of proposals we decided to fund from the first round. We're funding at least 8 proposals. We funded some intervention research. For example, to examine the impact of humane education. Another project on the effect of contact with farmed animals through different mediums, including virtual reality. We also funded a couple messaging research projects aimed at testing ways to persuade people to reduce their meat consumption. And also funded some work on topics like activist engagement and consumer acceptance of cultured meat, which we might hear a little bit about later this afternoon. So those are just some examples. What I'd like to get across, however, is we're mainly just interested in funding proposals with the potential to yield strong practical evidence about effective animal advocacy. I'm going to go over, we have 3 broad evaluation criteria, and I'm just going to go over those pretty quickly. So the importance of the proposal, the strength of the expected evidence, and the likelihood of success. So the first and most critical step of writing a grant proposal is choosing an important and unanswered research question. The questions that we like to ask when we're thinking about whether our question is important: does this question address a critical problem facing animal advocacy groups? Are there specific organizations struggling because they do not know the answer to this problem? And what specifically could organizations change or not change as a result of this research? We think those are pretty useful questions to determining whether the question you're asking is of practical importance. So you should state your research question up front in the proposal in simplest terms and be able to explain why it's an important research question and also justify why you think it hasn't satisfactorily been answered by past research. Choose a question. You may find it useful to familiarize yourself with past research in animal advocacy. ACE, for example, hosts a research library. That's a collection of past research that you can refer to. We think it's particularly useful to spend some time reading about how major animal advocacy groups spend their time and money. And finally, pay careful attention to our stated interests. For example, we place particular value on research that produces strong evidence about the effectiveness of various animal advocacy interventions. We think there are questions about many of the most common interventions that groups are using that, if answered, would allow advocates to have a much greater impact. Once you choose a research question, the next step is to design a study that will produce strong evidence that speaks to that question. So to estimate the strength of a proposal, as reviewers, we're going to carefully scrutinize the design and procedure of the study, the measures used, and the characteristics of the sample, where we're open to considering proposals of using all types of measures and methods. I think in general, we favor research that uses experimental designs, longitudinal measures, and if possible, measuring things like actual behavior or as close as possible to actual behavior. If you're uncertain about certain factors or particular factors influencing your design, we also recommend that you consider conducting or proposing preliminary pilot research. For example, if you're not sure what kind of response rate you'll get to a survey using a particular procedure, or you want to know more about the variance associated with an outcome measure for your power analyses, those can be critical. Rather than guessing what those are, if you're pretty uncertain, just incorporate that as part of the proposal. Finally, once you decide on an important topic and come up with a study design, you also need to assemble a qualified team and demonstrate that your project is likely to succeed. So we place particular value of teams that are made up of representatives from advocacy groups as well as researchers and academics, because we feel these teams are particularly well suited to design and execute the types of projects that we are interested in funding. So conferences like this are intended and I think are a great place to establish these kind of connections. So if you haven't done so already, I think everyone here is pretty friendly and open to discussing collaboration, so feel free to just boldly reach out to people who you've seen on stage here who have kind of piqued your interest. I'd also mention that ACE has recently put together a research collaboration directory. And so this is an online resource that allows advocates and academics who are interested in research and open to the possibility of collaborating to just list themselves on a public webpage. And then you'll be able to contact other people who have a mutual interest and vice versa. So if you're interested in that, come talk to me and we can put you on there. I expect after the conference we'll probably send all attendees an email about that. So importance of the proposal, strong evidence, and likelihood of success. The other point I really like to make, and it's kind of like a benign point, but I don't think it can be overstated, is that if we don't understand something or there's key details missing, it makes us really hard to evaluate a proposal positively, even if it's a good one. So taking the time to craft a well-organized proposal that's easy to read can really go a long way. We have a website, researchfund.animalcharityevaluators.org. You can find all this information on there. I'll be at the front of the room for most of the day, so come talk to me if you have any questions. But yeah, thank you for listening, and hopefully you will take an interest and start thinking through these ideas that you're coming up with during this conference, and maybe thinking about the possibility that you might actually be able to execute some of them through the Research Fund. Thank you. Okay, so now we are going to have our first panel, so if I could ask the panelists to come up. I'll just give the bios all at once at the beginning now, and then we'll go through the talk. So Jack Norris is a registered dietitian and co-founder and executive director of Vegan Outreach. Vegan Outreach is an animal protection organization that promotes a vegan lifestyle. In 2005, Jack was elected to the Animal Rights Hall of Fame. Sneha is pursuing an MA in forensic psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She graduated with a BSc degree in forensic psychology from the University of Portsmouth. She researched the effectiveness of vegan and vegetarian YouTube videos as her undergraduate research dissertation under the supervision of Dr. Diana Fleischman. Finally, Harish Sethu is the director of Humane League Labs, the research arm of the Humane League. He obtained his PhD in computer engineering from La Haye University and currently teaches and conducts research at a large private university in the areas of web security and data science. Harish has more than 25 years of experience as a researcher and has co-authored more than 70 peer-reviewed publications in the research literature. He is also the author of the blog Counting Animals. Please welcome our panelists.
Thank you, Greg. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the assessment that Vegan Outreach has been doing on some of our programs. And the main one is about leafleting effectiveness. But in order to talk about that, I want to briefly mention a couple of the other surveys we've been doing. One was for pay-per-view, where you ask people if they'll watch a video for $1, $1 to $3. And then we gave them a survey, and a few months later, we followed up with them. We didn't get much of a response on the follow-up. It turns out people need incentive to take surveys. However, I am going to talk a little bit about that data. And then we did something called a pay-per-read, where we paid people to read an online PDF of our booklets. We compared 4 different booklets and to see if there were any differences in diet change. depending on the booklet, and we didn't find any differences between booklets, but overall we found quite a bit of diet change. We didn't put a control group in that study because we felt like we could either spend money on adding a control group or adding a fourth booklet, and we decided we wanted to add the fourth booklet. But we're basing some of our leafleting effectiveness study on the paper read results. Okay. So assessing leafleting can be problematic for a number of reasons. One is when you go out and hand out booklets, it's hard to track people down afterwards, months later, to find out how their diet changed. And there's a number of effects of leafleting as well that are hard to measure. The first one, direct diet change, is the most obvious, but there's also the effects of word of mouth when you leaflet. You get a lot of people talking, discussing the booklet, sharing it sometimes with their friends and family, and so that's something that's important to try to think about when assessing leafleting. There's also touch points. It's likely that diet change happens after people are exposed to farm animal advocacy a number of times rather than just the first time. So, some research has suggested that people change after seeing something 7 times, or advertising works. I'm not really sure, and I don't know how that applies so much to getting diet change based on farm animal advocacy either. But it is likely that it takes a few touch points, and that possibly one of the reasons why the studies on our interventions find positive trends but not statistical significance is that you do need a number of touch points to create change. And finally, community building. Leafleting brings people into the movement, often as the first activity that they do, and gets people more committed in doing activism. So that's another aspect of leafleting that's positive, that leafleting is inexpensive to do, it's easy to set up, it doesn't require a lot of effort to get people involved. Okay, so our leafleting effectiveness study is only assessing direct diet change. We haven't figured out how to assess the other aspects of it, and first we want to make sure that we can assess direct diet change appropriately. We're in the pilot phase. We've done 3 pilot studies on it. We're hoping this third one that we're doing this fall will be our final pilot phase. And our main thing has been testing incentives to take surveys. So our first pilot was last fall, fall of 2015, and we handed out 5,000 booklets at 10 different colleges and 1,000 control booklets at 1 college. On the booklets, we put a sticker offering a $5 gift certificate for taking both the pre and post-test, the pre-test being the survey they take right then, the post-test being a survey they take a couple months later. We only got 88 responses to the treatment group, the ones who received the booklets, at a 1.8% response rate, which was quite low. And our control response rate was about the same rate. And so that led us to believe that there was not a bias in favor of animals for taking the survey. We were concerned that only people who cared about animals would take the survey, and we thought that this was a good indication that that wasn't the motivating factor for the survey. So at least we found that out of the first pilot study. We also discovered that $5 is probably not enough. I'm going to grab some. We did have some interesting pre-test responses, and I'm comparing them to our video pre-test surveys. We found that quite a few people were more sympathetic to farm animals after reading the booklets and seeing the videos. The videos did a little bit better in all these charts that I'm going to show you, but not a whole lot better. Percentage of mammal eaters wanting to eat less mammals was about 60% after reading the leaflet. Percentage of people wanting to eat less birds was greater, was significant. About 50% of fish eaters wanted to eat less fish. And dairy eaters, some people wanted to eat less dairy and some people wanted to eat less eggs. But I was pretty surprised at how many people wanted to eat less animals after reading. Now, whether they did or not, that's the question we have to answer. Okay, so pilot 2, we decided to create a larger incentive. We only handed out 100 booklets, 100 at 2 different schools. 100 of the booklets offered $10 to take this survey, and 100 offered $20. You had to take, we didn't give the gift certificate till you take the post test, and in these first 2 pilot studies. And we only got 3 responses and 2 respectively. So we were really surprised. We were very worried we were going to have to, that we would, well, the reason we did such few, we only did 100 booklets per test, was that we were worried about spending so much money on $20 gift certificates. So it turned out we didn't have to worry about that much. And we didn't do any follow-up on that survey in terms of the post-test. So this fall, we gave out 600 booklets, 100 at 6 different schools, or was it 200? It had 3 different schools. It was 100 at 6 different schools, yeah, I'm remembering right. We added a sticker that offered a $5 gift certificate to take the pre-test. So right away they got $5. They didn't have to wait to take the post-test. And then when they took the pre-test at the end, we offered $10. We told them that we would follow up in 2 months and offer them $10 in hopes that we would have a high post-test response. The pre-test response was 38, which was 6.3%, which was significantly higher than the less than 2% we got the first time. And we're doing the post-test later this month, and we're hoping that overall we get a 5% response rate. So we are optimistic about that, and we'll see, though, what happens. So we've created power calculations to determine how much it's going to cost for us to do a major study to try to find whether we can get statistical significance on diet change after leafleting. We're assuming a 5% response rate for both studies, and we're basing how many booklets we need based on our paper read diet change rate. This was our paper read results, where the odds ratios for avoiding animal products at the post-test versus the pre-test. And we had a pretty good response rate. For example, beef, people were about 1.6 times more likely to be avoiding beef at post-test compared to pre-test. And then chicken, dairy, eggs people were more likely to avoid all of those foods. Fish, people were not more likely to avoid, but pork and turkey they were. When you add all the non-vegan foods up, there was about a 1.6 chance of avoiding foods on the post-test. To make that, put it in a chart like this. Here you can see how many people were avoiding foods at the beginning. So for example, 2.5% were avoiding all non-vegan foods at pre-test, 3.7 were avoiding it at post-test. Beef, people were quite a few beef avoiders at pre-test. Okay, so to create our power calculations, we determined that we would need, if we want an 80% chance of finding a statistically significant difference among any non-vegan food, we would need 63,800 booklets. For any non-vegan food except fish, it would be 30,800, and that's what we're going to be trying for. So we want to add a control group if we assume that no change in the control group, then we need about 500 to 1,000 control participants, which means about 10,000 more booklets. And the costs for this are, for the incentives, for the gift certificates, $33,000. For the stickers, $6,000. For the booklets, about close to $3,000. And it will take about 245 hours of stickering. Now, if we do this all at once, there might be a way to get some of these costs down. But the total for doing an effective leafleting study, we think, is probably going to be about $40,000. And that's really my presentation, so thank you very much.
I will be talking about the effectiveness of various vegan and vegetarian YouTube videos that use an ethical approach. Effectiveness. Animal rights organizations pour considerable amount of funding and effort into making advocacy videos, and also individuals who record undercover videos take considerable risks in doing so. So it is important to understand how effective these videos are, if they're effective at all, and what effects they have on the viewers. Ethics. The reason this study focuses mostly on the ethics of YouTube videos is because ethics, researchers found ethics to be the major motivating factor for a meat-free diet. And also when ethics is adopted as a motivating factor, individuals reported to avoiding more meat-based food, and also made the transition more rapidly to a meat-free diet. YouTube. The reason that the study restricted the videos to YouTube videos was because YouTube, 3 reasons. YouTube was found to be the most popular video sharing engine, and 2, because if I used more than one video sharing engine, it was more likely that differences that I would find were because of the differences in the engines itself, the video sharing engines, and not because of the approaches that were used. 3, because YouTube allows viewers to give feedback on the videos, likes, dislikes, and comments, which can be analyzed. Also, video sharing engines, when videos are put up on the engines, these are the viewers this is the actual population that the videos are reaching, as opposed to having an experimental study. So all of the videos in the study were taken from organizations and not from individual uploaders, because organizations have similar videos because they're funded. And if I had used both organization and individual videos, it would be more likely that differences found would be because of the differences in the making of the videos, and not because of the approaches that were used. Okay, so the videos that were collected were within the span of 5 years, and the 5-year time span was maintained because to account for any differences in attitudes towards vegan or vegetarian lifestyle, and also differences in YouTube popularity, and also the type of videos that were made. So the videos that were selected were also restricted to ethics of raising and eating animals. And this was done because other issues might have contributed to people refraining from wearing animals or using animals for entertainment and other ethical reasons. So this study just focuses on the raising and eating animals. So overall, 99 videos were selected, and they went through a selection process, and 30 videos were picked out. So videos that included, that specified a certain cuisines like foie gras or veal were removed to avoid differences in people's attitudes towards the cuisine, and not raising and eating animals as a whole. And also videos that mentioned regions, certain regions, or certain slaughterhouses or certain companies were removed to keep the focus on the approach and not the regions or the companies. Overall, 3 categories were identified, and these categories were also suggested from other leafleting studies and video studies that were conducted on the effectiveness of outreach. So the direct exposure category was mostly undercover videos. So these videos were, they had no vocal explanation, and no vocal explanation, it was just undercover videos, and 2 subcategories were involved in this. a general subcategory which focused on all food animals, and a focus subcategory which focused on just one species. The informative and explanatory category were mostly videos that gave information, vocal information and explanations about what was happening in the video. The Sethu subcategories, cruelty-focused and narrator-focused. So the cruelty-focused subcategory was mostly focused on the cruelty involved in raising animals for food, and the narrator-focused videos mostly focused on the narrator who was narrating what was happening. So no cruelty was really shown in the narrator-focused video, but in the cruelty-focused, there was more video coverage on the cruelty. Alternative category involved the alternative life that the animals could have had, as opposed to being in slaughterhouses, which is sanctuaries. So this involved rescue escape videos and sanctuary videos. Rescue escape videos were videos of animals who had been rescued from slaughterhouses and taken into farm sanctuaries, or animals who had escaped. So these videos followed their story. And the sanctuary videos were mostly videos of animals in sanctuaries, the relationships that they had and, with each other or with people. The views and comments in the categories, well, the videos were placed in categories to ensure that there was no difference in the number of views or comments, to ensure that any differences that were found later were not because of the differences in the number of views or the number of comments. Okay, so two things were measured in the study. One was video popularity and the other was effectiveness. Video popularity was determined through like-dislike ratio, and the alternative life category had significantly more, it was significantly more popular than the other two categories, so it had more likes and less dislikes. And between, within the major categories, there was no difference between videos that focused on all food animals in general or videos that focused on certain species. But there was a difference in the popularity of the narrator-focused videos as opposed to videos that focused on cruelty in the informative and explanatory category. And again, in alternative life, there was no difference between the popularity of the rescue escape videos and the sanctuary life videos. So for effectiveness, this was measured in two ways. One was the use of linguistic inquiry and word count. So all the comments from the categories were run through separately thrice through linguistic inquiry and word count. One for word categories, that was emotion words, sad, angry, positive, and negative emotions. And the second was for wedge categories. I will show it to you in the next slide. And the use of vegan, vegetarian words. This was the dictionary that I had made to, that's the phrases, those are the phrases that were involved in the vegan dictionary, and those were the vegetarian, and those were change of source, and those are the terms. So in this, the alternative life videos had significantly more positive emotions and sad emotions as compared to the other two. And the informative and explanatory category had more use of wedge terms in the comments. So people discussed, this would suggest that they discussed vegan, vegetarian, veganism, vegetarian more in the comments. So I guess you could say that the informative category encouraged a discussion of diet change. Another measure of effectiveness was comment rating. So 20 comments from each video, which picked in random order. So we had 100 comments from each subcategory and 200 from each major category, and these are rated by vegan, a vegetarian, and a meat eater. For the likeliness to go vegan, vegetarian, likeliness to reduce meat intake, likeliness to change meat source, and concern for animal welfare. Oh, and also positively towards vegan and vegetarian lifestyle. In this, there was no difference found overall between the likeliness to go vegan or vegetarian likeliness to reduce meat intake or likeliness to change meat source between the major categories. But there was a difference found overall in display of concern, with the direct exposure invoking more display of concern in the commenters, and also in reinforcement with the alternative category, reinforcing vegan vegetarian lifestyle more than the other two, and also a display in positive attitude, where the alternative category had significantly higher ratings. Within the direct exposure subcategory, the general subcategory had significantly more ratings for change of source and also concern towards animal welfare when compared to the focus subcategory. I thought this was interesting because there was no difference between the narrator-focused videos or the cruelty-focused videos in their effectiveness, but the narrator-focused videos they were significantly more popular than the cruelty-focused videos, but that didn't necessarily mean that they were more effective. It didn't mean that they were more effective or less effective. So the rescue escape subcategory had significantly more likeliness to reduce, likeliness to go vegan or vegetarian than the sanctuary subcategory, which is also interesting because they both were equally popular. But I guess the rescue escape category was slightly more effective in likeliness to change diet. That's just the table with everything in it. So in conclusion, the results of the study found that the approaches had influence on video popularity and effectiveness. The alternative category was more popular, and the use of celebrities or narrators in the informative and explanatory category was more popular among the viewers than just the use of just to focus on cruelty. Also, the alternative approach produced more positive and sad emotions compared to the other two categories. Also, informing people or explaining what goes on in the raising and eating of animals encouraged more of a discussion about the veg lifestyle in the comments. Also, the direct exposure, that's the undercover videos, produced a slightly higher concern towards animal welfare, and so did the alternative category. Well, of course, this study mostly looked into the comments and feedback left back by the viewers on the videos. So it's not the actual change that they did make in their life, but it's an indication. So I guess future research could look into whether they actually did go on to make these changes. So they could be followed up. Also, the viewers could be encouraged in a standardized format whether the video actually was effective in influencing them and changing their lifestyle. That's about it.
You can just use this mic.
I wanted this hanging on straight.
Okay, thanks.
Good morning, friends. My name is Harish Sethu, and I'm representing Humane League Labs here, which is the research arm of the Humane League. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So today I'm going to give a talk on meeting the challenges of statistical power. And of course, this is a very vast topic, so I'm going to focus very specifically on one challenge, which is the challenge of having to work with dietary data and how self-reported dietary data sometimes presents us a very difficult challenge in meeting achieving an acceptable statistical power. So let's dive into what it means, what self-reported dietary data means, and how it is collected. It's typically collected using 24-hour recall or 48-hour recall methods, where you actually ask someone what they have eaten, everything that they have eaten in the last 24 or 48 hours. And sometimes it is collected using food frequency questionnaires, where you ask them how many servings of chicken you have eaten in the last 1 week, or how many times have you eaten meat during the last week, or questions like that. And you're trying to actually get at the average rate of consumption of these individuals. And sometimes you're also going to ask them to basically write a food diary or something like that. So, but all of these methods are very good methods in the sense that they are easy to conduct, these types of surveys. They are also reasonably cheap, and they are very fast. On Mechanical Turk, for example, in just less than 2 or 3 days, you can gather a whole bunch of data on hundreds of people, for example. But there are errors that creep into these, self-reported surveys, and these errors are what I'm going to talk about today. So there are 2 types of errors: biased errors and unbiased errors. The biased errors are those which skew the data in one particular direction, and most of you already know about these biased errors. There is the social desirability bias, there is underreporting, overreporting, and false reporting. Even if there is no social desirability bias, there is also correlated errors and weighting errors. And the best illustration of all of these errors comes from what happened recently with the election polling data, right? And since we are here at Princeton, and I'm going to pick on Princeton's election consortium, which is run by a very famous data scientist, very, very sophisticated, super smart data scientist called Sam Wong, who works here at Princeton University, who used the most sophisticated analytical methods that exist. And he said that the probability of Clinton getting re-elected was greater than 99% throughout, right? And he also said, and in fact, there was a brief period of time when that number was actually 100%, a few days before the election. So we cannot rely. It just shows you that the limits of data science. It just shows you that we cannot rely on people. In order to find out what people will actually do, we cannot rely on people telling us what they are going to do. And that is the point that I'm going to make today. But I'm not even going to talk about all these different types of biased errors today. Those errors alone are enough for us to cast a skeptical eye on, experimental results that come from self-reported data. I'm not even going to talk about them, but I'm going to talk about just the unbiased errors. That alone is enough for me to make the point. And in fact, the unbiased errors are often ignored and often not even addressed in most papers, including academic journals, and so on. So that is what I'm going to focus on today. One unbiased source of unbiased error is true variance across time. So as you ask someone what they have eaten in the last 24 hours, that is not capturing the average rate at which they are eating a particular food, like chickens, for example, because what they would have eaten in the previous 24 hours would be different from what they would have eaten in the previous 24 hours again, and so on. I might go to KFC and eat a bucket of chicken legs one day and not another day, for example. And so there is true variance across time. Then there is measurement error. If I ask you how many servings of potatoes have you eaten during the last week, I'm sure you have no idea. I don't have any idea. You'll come up with some random number, and that is highly likely to be inaccurate number, right? So measurement error is another big reason. So I'm going to talk about how that diminishes the power of our experiments, and how and what are some things that we can actually do to mitigate or eliminate some of these problems. So let's very quickly start with what is statistical power. Statistical power is the statistical power of an experiment to detect something, let's say a reduction in meat consumption by 5%. The statistical power of an experiment to detect something, let's say X, is the probability that it will detect X if X is there to be detected. So if certain meat consumption reduction actually did happen, what's the likelihood that your experiment will actually detect that detect that? So let's take a look at servings of chickens consumed per week as to illustrate what I'm going to illustrate all of what I'm going to talk about today. So let's say the true number of servings of chicken eaten per week is on the horizontal axis, and the number of people is on the vertical axis, and this is a histogram. And let's suppose this is what it looks like in reality, and this is the control group that I might use, right? And let's say that the mean rate at which people are eating chickens, mean number of servings of chickens that people are eating is 10. Let's suppose what happens with an intervention group. Let's say after we do an intervention, like we give them our ethical or whatever message about chicken consumption, and let's suppose that the mean number of servings of chicken eaten is 5 now. That is half the rate at which people are eating. This is actually very easy to detect. This is great. There's substantial difference between these two histograms. But the reality is that that is not what actually happens. It looks something like this. In reality, the meat consumption, most of our, as a result of most of our interventions, reduces by like 5%. Our effect sizes are low. And so this is much harder to detect. It's like the mean is now only 9.5. The difference between these two histograms is not that obvious anymore. So let's now look at an idealized experiment. Let's imagine a whole world full of people, and I'm going to separate this whole world full of people into control and intervention. And now I'm going to have to take a sample of the control and the intervention. And let's assume, this is an idealized experiment, I'm going to assume that the distribution of the number of servings of chickens that people are eating, the true distribution is normal. This is like, it's along the normal curve as shown here. And the intervention group has an average of 9.5 and the control group has an average of 10. Okay. Okay. So let's assume that is the case. Then I want the statistical power of my experiment to lie at 80% or above in this range, in the green range, and the p-value, which is the false positive rate, in the sense that let's suppose there is no effects at all, but I still somehow detect an effect. The false positive rate should be under 5%. And so in general, in experiments, you want your experimental results to have a power in the green range and the p-value in the green range here, and so on. And in order to achieve in general, you also want your power on most of the time, you want it to be above 50%, because you want your experiment to detect the effect more likely than not detect the effect at all. So you want it to be at least kind of above 50%. Right? So the minimum size of the sample needed, you can do a mathematical analysis and come up with the fact that you need 788 people, control and intervention combined, to have to achieve these requirements of power and p-value. And so I will take 394 people in each of control and intervention groups to make up the 788 people, and then let's suppose I assume that everyone reports absolutely accurately the data about how many servings of chickens they have eaten, absolutely accurately. Let's suppose they report that, then I will get a power of 80%, which is acceptable, and I will get a p-value of 5%, which is acceptable, and everything is fine. Provided, of course, people have reported accurately the average daily rate of consumption, right? That is not what happens, right? So let's assume what happens with true variance across time, right? True variance across time. I'm going to now assume that this true variance is also normally distributed, and the standard deviation is about 20% of the mean. And this is a very, very conservative assumption. So let me give you an example. Let's suppose I report that I'm eating 10 servings of chickens per week. And let's suppose that is my average. But some weeks I might go and buy a bucket of chicken legs at KFC. Some weeks I might not. It's very easy that some weeks I will eat 12 servings, some weeks I will eat only 8 servings, some weeks I might eat 15 servings. So 20% plus or minus is just the average. That's very, very normal. In fact, reality is probably higher. The variance is much higher. So let's assume that it is 20% of the mean is the variance, the true variance across time. And then what happens to the power of my experiment? It actually ends up at 58%. It has come down substantially lower. and the p-value is now at 5%. But if I insist that I want to absolutely detect it and I want to have increase the power to 80%, then my false positive rate increases to 18% and it goes into an unacceptable territory again. So let's now add measurement error. And measurement error again is something that I will assume is 20% around the mean. So for example, if I ask you if supposing that in reality you have eaten exactly 5 servings of potatoes last week, but I ask you how many servings of potatoes you have eaten last week, you have no idea. And you might say 4, you might say 6, you might say 7, you might say 3. Plus or minus 20% is very, very normal measurement error. It's totally acceptable. And so a standard deviation of 20 plus or minus 20% is what I will assume. And with that assumption added to the power of my experiment, what happens? I get only 44% power. It is worse than even tossing a coin to, help us, answer this question a little bit, right? And and the p-value becomes is at 5%. Well, supposing I insist that I do have power of more than 80%, then the p-value reaches an unacceptable 32%. That means 32% likely that 32% is the false positive rate. That is, you will detect an effect when there is now no effect at all, and that is not reasonable. In science, you normally want to have a p-value of less than 5%, and so on. Let's suppose in general, confidence intervals. In general, we also want to see what is the probability that we will find different sizes of effects. So 5% is the true effect size in this case that I'm assuming, right? But there is only about 1/3 probability that I will find an effect size which is 4 to 6%. There is 1/3 probability about that I'll find 0 to 4%, 1/3 I'll find 6 to 10%, even when the true effect size is exactly 5%. And there is a certain probability that I'll find that there is no effect at all, even when there was a 5% effect. In fact, even if the true effect size is 5%, and even if I actually measure a 5% effect size, so I'm very, very lucky that I measured 5% effect size, because even that is only 1/3 probability or much less. If I'm able to actually measure that, the 95% confidence interval with the variance that are very conservative variances that I assumed goes from here all the way and it reaches into the -0 territory. That means I am not entitled to claim anymore that there was even a positive effect size. And remember, this is even though the true effect size is 5%, and even though I actually even measured in my sample a 5% effect size, I still am not entitled to scientifically claim that with 95% confidence that there was even an effect of even 0. Right? So this is the limitation of self-reported surveys. So what are the solutions? The solutions are that if we do use self-reported survey data in the matter of diet, we should make sure to measure both the bias and the noise in the errors, so both biased and unbiased errors, whenever possible. We should actually measure them, and we should not ignore them like it often gets ignored. We should actually make sure that the power calculations incorporate, before we even do the experiments, the power calculations should incorporate the estimates of these biased and unbiased errors. Unbiased errors are always ignored often. The unbiased errors are also taken care of. Claims that we make should be consistent with the 95% confidence intervals, because confidence intervals are important, because confidence intervals capture better than p-values the variance that you observe in the data. And so confidence intervals, the 95% confidence intervals that we report should be consistent with the claims that we make. And in general, I think self-reported data is not necessarily a bad thing as long as we ask questions that are likely to yield more accurate answers. As opposed to asking people how many servings of potatoes or anything else that you have eaten over the last week or month or something, which is unlikely to give us accurate answers, we should ask questions that are likely to yield more accurate answers, and then we are likely to get, better and more credible results. But in general, it is better to avoid self-reported survey data altogether. And we should be trying to measure what people do and not be measuring what people say they do. And of course, it is much harder logistically, it's much harder to conduct those experiments where we actually measure what people do. It is also something that costs more. Unfortunately, it can cost substantially more, and it takes longer as well. But it is more likely to discover truth. That's all I had for today.
There we go. Thank you very much to all our panelists. Now we have a bit of time for a Q&A. We'll probably get one mic on either side.
Sure. Thanks so much for these presentations. My question is a very simple one. What's a serving size? How do we decide what a serving size is? How do we communicate in our surveys what a serving size is? I feel like it's a huge place where we get measurement. I'm over here.
Oh, there. Oh.
Yeah, what's a serving size, and how do we measure it? How do we get reliable data in this question of what a serving size is?
I think that's the first of the problems, because different people have, that is part of the measurement error. Different people have altogether different ideas of what a serving size is, and so that itself causes problems. So sometimes surveys will try to show pictures of, a chunk of meat or something like that to give an indication of a serving size. But still, people don't really have necessarily a good idea. Sometimes, so that goes into the measurement error. Yes.
Harish, one of the things that we were trying to do is measure avoidance. And so I wonder if the measurement error is better that way, if someone can say, I don't eat this food at all.
Yeah. So the question is, I think that's a very valid one. So in general, if you are asking whether you are vegetarian, whether you don't eat any particular food at all, you would think that you would get a more accurate answer, because it's easier to answer accurately if you know the answer, right? And the problem with that, and that's better than asking the number of servings. That is definitely better. But there is a very high false positive rate in it, in that question. And the reason is, only 2% of the people, according to the Funalytics study, which had very carefully tried to avoid social desirability bias, for example, only 2% of the people are actually vegetarian, right? And so 98% of the people would have to correctly report that they do eat meat. That means if your error is if there is an error of even 2% in those 98% of the people reporting whether or not they eat meat, you have the accuracy with which we are predicting how many vegetarians there are is wrong by 100%, right? So 98% of the people would have to absolutely all of them correctly report that they do eat meat. If even 2% of them incorrectly report that, then there would be, you will end up with like 2% vegetarians plus another 2% vegetarians. Our estimate of how many vegetarians there are will be wrong by 100%. So the false positive rate is very, very high, and the difficulty of making sure that everyone who eats meat correctly reports that they eat meat with 99.99% accuracy makes the problem much harder. So, but you're right that it is a better question to ask than how many servings of chicken someone has eaten.
I have a question for about the video effectiveness. One is that to use likes and dislikes as your measure of effectiveness, or that ratio, I was wondering, how did you account for basically, I guess it goes to variance, but likes and dislikes are going to have momentum that's going to speed and slow, and it might also be tied to the organization's promotion of the video. You send a high-profile article to that link, sharing of that link. And also the using word count makes me wonder if you are, yes, you're normalizing the videos, but you wind up not looking at the very qualities of the medium of video, which could lend to its effectiveness, such as the actual images used, the transitions between the images, the narration or the story arc of the video. So, those are the things that might be more compelling than reading an article. So those are my main questions.
The likes and dislikes ratio was used for popularity, not effectiveness, though. So it's not a measure of effectiveness, just how popular the video was. And can I please hear the second part of your question again?
It was just, the main elements or the things that make a video versus a different medium weren't really, I don't see how they were looked at in the study, so how can you, how could that be
what different medium
looking
are
at
you
effectiveness
referring
of it? It seems like you were looking at the effectiveness of the copywriting or the message.
Oh, you mean the comments?
No. Well, maybe you could explain, how were you actually looking at video as a medium?
Okay, so the videos were out there, and the only feedback that we did have on the videos were the likes, dislikes, and comments. There weren't any other feedbacks. So measuring the effectiveness through the comments was the best that could be done with the video.
What do you mean subject?
Oh, the differences between them. That's why they were categorized to address those and then compared. And they also had subcategories to address the variations within each category. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question at all?
Yeah, I'll talk to you about it later.
Sorry.
Yeah, hi, I'm Doris Schneeberger. I'm from the Austrian Vegan Society, and my question goes to the third speaker again. I wanted to know whether you could elaborate on how you can exactly measure what people do instead what they claim they do.
Yes, the question is, how do we measure what people actually do versus what people say they do? I think that's a very difficult question to answer as far as individuals is concerned. But so one individual, what he's actually doing or she's actually doing is much harder to find, and that's definitely a challenge. But in the aggregate, there are many ways in which we can actually measure. And aggregate is all that we need to answer the questions that we want to answer about animal advocates. So for example, if you do an intervention in a dorm, for example, and monitor the dorm's cafeteria's consumption pattern, for example, and have, keep track of the inventory or do something like that, you can actually find out exactly how much people are eating and what different foods people are choosing and not choosing and so on. So in the aggregate at restaurants, in the aggregate at supermarkets, grocery store, using supermarket grocery store scanner data that Humane League Labs is using, or in the aggregate at dining services, and in the aggregate at a variety of instances, and even engineered situations. In the aggregate we can measure, and that is adequate enough for us to measure the impact of advocacy strategies. Yes.
So the more variables that you're testing for, I'm curious if the effect is, the smaller it is, the harder it is to be certain of it.
Yes.
But imagine an isolated population like a college campus where literally all students only eat from that campus, and you do many types of outreach at the same time. You'd be able to see from the cafeteria what people are eating and be fairly certain because there's no other ways for them to get food. are there situations where, would it be better to focus on one particular type of outreach or to do everything? I'm imagining like an isolated campus in the middle of nowhere, and basically it's used as a experiment where you outreach as much as possible through every method you can to see what effect you can have in total. If you're so effective, like let's say you bring the meat consumption down on that campus 60%. If you're so effective through all of the methods you've tried, how would it be important to try and specifically figure out which method it was? Because when you add them all together, it's more effective for someone to get a leaflet and see a poster and hear the professor talk about it.
Sure. And I guess that the question is then one would have to design an experiment where you do use only one particular method of outreach and test that, and then use another different method of outreach at another similar campus, for example, and test that, and one could try to parse out the differences between the effectiveness of different outreach methods. So yes, you could do that. I don't think we are there yet because we don't even know how much all of the interventions, all of the outreach, all together, what the effect size is. But that would be something that hopefully will get done in the years to come.
Hi, my name is Jody. I'm a psychologist at Princeton Healthcare, and I had a question for Jack Norris. You spoke in your leafleting studies about the problem with the salience of the incentive, and I was wondering if you had experimented with using incentives in a population that the strength of the incentives would be more powerful, maybe not a college campus or a school campus, but some other groups of.
The question is whether we've experimented with our incentives in locations where they might be more effective than a college campus. Well, since most of our leafleting is done on college campuses, we want to measure the diet change on the campus. So no, we haven't done that. But we tend to think that if incentive is going to be it was a gift certificate to either Amazon or Starbucks. And we feel as though if that incentive is going to work anywhere, it's probably going to work on a college campus because people don't have as much disposable income. But we're not sure, and no, we haven't. But that's an interesting idea.
Hi, I'm Patrick Miller, a philosophy grad student here at Princeton. Since one of our primary goals is to reduce the amount of suffering that happens from factory farming, I thought we were trying to render that project no longer profitable. So I'm wondering why we aren't measuring how much people think they're spending on products which directly line the pockets of people engaged in the factory farming.
So I think I don't know, at least from my point of view, what I care about is the suffering of the animals. And so there is always, it's very hard to measure exactly how much suffering somebody is, so you are saying that instead of measuring how many servings of chickens people are eating, we are actually going to measure how many dollars are being spent on meat?
Yeah, how much do they think they spent on chicken at the grocery store this week?
As opposed to how many servings of chicken they have eaten. We could ask that, but they would have to kept a record of that, yes. I don't know if that is any easier to remember for people than the number of servings of chickens.
Go ahead. Yes, over here. Yeah, just a quick question. A lot of the research that we've seen over the past couple days seems similar as far as interventions, and given the problems with power and financing that we've seen that can be discouraging, What thoughts have been given to, or have any meta-analyses been done? Or is it any thought to keeping research similar enough in the future so it's amenable to meta-analysis?
Okay. I don't think we have enough of a body of research yet in the farm animal advocacy movement to do a meta-analysis yet. I feel that we don't have that yet. Because meta-analysis requires a large body of research already, all of them trying to address somewhat similar questions and so on. And also most of the research is still using self-reported data so far, and which is perfectly all right. I mean, Humane League Labs also has done research using self-reported data in the past, and it's perfectly all right, because when you are first doing pioneering research, you're trying to answer questions for the first time, it's perfectly reasonable to start with self-reported data to just to get an idea of what the effect size is. But I think it will be few more years before we are at the point where we are starting to do meta-analysis based on multiple types of, multiple research done by multiple different organizations and combining them and doing some analysis based on all of that. We are not there yet. The other part of your question was financing and the fact that it is more expensive to do research that avoids self-reported data. I think that was your question. Yes, so yeah, that is a barrier, but I think it costs what it costs. We have to find the truth, and it costs what it costs, and we cannot avoid that. I mean, we cannot say that, well, this is expensive to do, so I'm going to do something that may not even find out the truth, and that's kind of just on the wasteful, right? I mean, it's not necessarily a better use of funds. In these contexts, for example, a pooled set of funds like what ACE is doing, for example, and so on, helps us to make sure that there is no repeatability of studies. Some proposals people are not repeating necessarily the same experiments again and again unnecessarily sometimes, especially if they are based on self-reports alone, that we achieve a certain diversity in our approaches to conducting these experiments and so on, so that one cross-validates another approach and so on. So these are all things that will probably happen in the years to come and would be ways to actually reduce the total cost of the ratio of the cost of doing the research and the truth that we actually are able to get out of them.
Let's give a warm round to our panel here.